Warning. My fanfic contains mentions of blood, abuse, and torture. Viewer discretion is advised.
Sebastian shuffled towards the table by the fireplace and grabbed a pile of folded clothing. It was one of Anne's school uniforms. He walked back towards Mika and handed them to her.
Oh, here. Hopefully this fits. It should hold you over until we can get you a proper uniform.
Oh, thank you. Do you have somewhere I can change?
Mika took the uniform and frowned as she gazed at her tattered clothing.
Oh, of course. Right here.
Sebastian pointed behind the curtains that were draped to separate the rooms. He then pulled the string as the curtains fell gracefully to give Mika some privacy to change.
That should do it.
Mika found herself chuckling as she slipped into the uniform. She then stepped out from behind the curtains as she locked her gaze onto Anne, who was seated by the fireplace.
Oh, Mika, you're awake!
Anne looked different from what Mika was accustomed to. Her cheeks were sunken in, her skin was pale, and she had deep purple bags under her eyes.
Anne, this may be a bit forward, but are you all right?
Oh, yeah, I'm all right. I was cursed over the summer.
She was cursed by goblins. There was a fire in the middle of the night. Flames were shooting from the abandoned estate on the hill. Before my uncle and I could stop her, Anne rushed out, worried someone be hurt. Goblins were frantically stamping out the flames when suddenly, through the smoke, we heard an icy voice. Children should be seen and not heard. A blinding blast followed. They didn't even give her a chance to run.
Anne, I'm so sorry.
It's all right. The pain from this curse comes in bouts. It's not anyone's fault. I'm glad the uniform fits.
Anne, are you coming with us to Hogwarts?
I don't think so, Sebastian.
Anne, if I may be able to help you.
What? How?
Sebastian and Anne exchanged confused, yet intrigued glances at one another, while Mika walked over to the bucket of water that remained by the bedside. She picked it up and carried it over to the table. She beckoned Anne over to sit by the table while giving her a calm smile. Anne obliged and walked over to the table weakly before sitting down. Mika then placed her hand into the bucket of water while shutting her eyes and inhaling sharply. The water began to form a sort of bubble around her hand as she slowly pulled it out of the bucket. She opened her eyes abruptly, which were now glowing that familiar turquoise from before. Sebastian stood nearby with his arms folded over his chest as he watched intently. Mika then took Anne's hands into her own as the bubble of water enveloped both of their entwined hands. The water began traveling up Anne's arms before reaching her chest. Once there, the water bubble began to glow turquoise. Anne's breathing shuddered as her eyes watched in amazement. She then exhaled sharply as the glow changed from turquoise to crimson, red, and black. The water then began to travel, its way back down Anne's arms towards Mika's. The water made its way toward Mika's chest before completely dissolving into her chest cavity. Mika's breathing hitched as she winced briefly. She closed her eyes again and slowly exhaled before opening them again. Her eyes slowly roamed Anne's face as she watched her color return. She smiled warmly at her before pulling away suddenly. She began coughing violently before catching her breath. Sebastian's eyes widened in surprise as he rushed to Anne's side and cupped her face in his hands, his gaze roaming Anne's face carefully.
How did you do that?
I'm not sure how to explain it. I just know that I can.
Thank you. I have no idea how I'll ever be able to repay you.
A small smile swept across Mika's face at Sebastian's gratitude for curing his sister.
I guess I can return to Hogwarts after all.
However, her expression quickly changed to that of fear as she frantically looked around the cottage.
Anne, Sebastian, where's Solomon?
He's probably outside mingling with the townsfolk. Why?
We need to go. Now!
Mika grabbed both of the twins' hands as she abruptly apparated them outside the grounds of Hogwarts. The twins coughed violently as they glanced around and noticed Hogwarts before them.
What was that all about?
I'm sorry, but your uncle is dangerous.
Dangerous? How?
He works for my Uncle Mikael. I overheard them during one of my uncle's secret meetings. He took everything from me, from us.
As Mika was in the process of explaining the danger they were in with Solomon Sallow, a storm began to roll in.
You can tell us more later. Let's get inside. It's starting to rain.
Sebastian reached for Mika's hand. The three jogged into the castle. All the while, Mika was looking over her shoulder constantly, cautiously glancing around every corner they passed as they walked through the entrance of the large castle. They arrived to the entrance of the Great Hall, but stopped in front of the House Point hourglasses. Mika looked at them with sorrow in her eyes before shaking her head to regain her composure. They trudged onwards towards the grand staircase when they were stopped by Professor Black, who looked at them with a raised brow and curious expression. His hands folded behind his back as he glanced at them.
Well, if it isn't the Sallow twins, what brings you here so early?
Apologies, Professor, but we ran into the missing first year, Mika LeFay. She wanted to come back to Hogwarts, sir.
I see. Well, welcome back, Miss LeFay. Please see yourselves to your common room at once. The sorting ceremony will begin tomorrow morning.
Headmaster Black promptly strode past them. Mika and the twins stood there for a moment, completely dumbfounded, before making their way to the dungeons. Upon reaching the entrance to the Slytherin common room, Sebastian stood firmly before the blank wall and announced the password aloud.
Aspiration.
The bronze body of a snake slithered its way up the wall in an arch as the door was revealed. The three of them trotted through the door and down the spiral stairs to their common room. There were 2 chairs positioned in front of the fireplace, where Sebastian and Anne seated themselves. Mika levitated into a seated position between them. The twins were awestruck as they watched her float in place. Silence befell the small group as they all exchanged glances. Mika shifted around in the air before looking at the twins with a serious expression.
I have something to show you.
Sebastian and Anne looked at Mika with concern swept across their faces. Mika outstretched both of her hands towards them.
Do you trust me?
The twins hesitated for a moment before they each took a hand into their own.
Of course we trust you. You've been our best friend for ages.
Mika gave them a small smile before closing her eyes. The twins followed suit and closed their eyes as well. She exhaled slowly before taking a sharp inhale. Their minds connected as memories began to flood into view. But not just any memories, they were Mika's memories. Tears streamed down the twins' cheeks as memories of their parents flashed in their minds. Mika honed her focus on the memory of her kidnapping. Their minds swirled for a moment before a clear vision of the memory came into focus.
There Mika sat in front of the fireplace in the common room, her mother's spellbook in hand. A shadow figure came up from behind her, placing a burlap sack over her head as she screamed and kicked. The figure carried her out of the common room and promptly out of Hogwarts. When the bag was removed from her head, she found herself in a dungeon cell. Cobwebs littered the corners. The stone floors were damp and cold. The only light was that of the enchanted candles that levitated outside the cell.
You will never leave this place again. I will have answers from you, one way or another.
Mikael chuckled to himself as he locked the cell door and exited the dungeons. Young Mika found herself crying and frantically tugging on the cell door. The memory sped forward through the last 5 years. Images of Mika secretly reading her mother's spellbook and practicing its contents. Other images also flashed of Mikael casting Crucio on her repeatedly.
Crucio, Crucio, Crucio.
Her cries echoing through the dungeons. He cast Diffindo, Confringo and even Bombarda on the poor girl as large gashes and wounds were stretched across her body.
Tell me, or I'll end your miserable excuse for a life.
She tried protecting herself numerous times, but to no avail. She was far too weak from the pain she endured. The image suddenly shifted and Mika was alone, lying on the damp stone floor. Voices echoed through the dungeons in the distance. The voice was deep and guttural, but somehow familiar.
That girl won't tell you anything. Why not kill her and be done with it?
That won't do. I need her. She's far more valuable alive, lest we forget that you killed her mother.
I'm not going to explain myself to you. I killed my own brother too.
Suddenly the deep voice was easier to recognize. It was Solomon.
At least you made it look like an accident. Those kids will never learn the truth.
Sebastian is smart. If he decides to dig into this, he might very well figure out the truth. He's stubborn, just like my brother. Let's focus on getting the family secrets out of this one first.
Solomon and Mikael exchanged words over their plans before the memory began to warp and twist. There was a bolt of lightning that burst into frame to when the twins and Mika reunited, before fading to black.
This concludes Chapter 1. More chapters are on their way. Stay tuned, and thank you for your continued support.